Let's start with interest and penalties, because this is one thing that I really don't know many people out there doing. A few organizations are actively tracking them, pursuing them, at least in my experience and having been asking that question. They kind of just see the payments pop up on the PLBs, right? We see the, what is it, L6? Is my
It's
memory serving me?
L6. Yeah. Well,
A few other ones.
It pops up on a few different spots of the 835 itself, but yeah, it's ultimately at the end of the day, it's the PLB segment that it flows into usually a separate line item on the general ledger that not many people are paying attention to.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of hiding, but hiding in plain sight at the same time. And again, just another reason that it's probably overlooked. But you want to change that, and I'm excited for that. So let's keep it simple to start.
Sure.
For those who were like, PLB, L6, what are you talking about? But even bigger, right? Interest and penalties. 101. What are we talking about?
Yeah. So all 50 states have prompt pay laws. And those laws essentially stipulate for insurance carriers that they have so many days to either pay or deny a claim. And if they don't make that payment or make that denial within that time period, the state then stipulates either an interest penalty or a penalty associated with that claim. Now, there are caveats where, if it's denied and there's follow-up, then, the provider has 30 days to do that. And then the insurance carrier has another 30 days to respond, et cetera, et cetera. But at a very high level, all states require and have on the books rules around timely payment. And if that timely payment isn't met, there is some sort of penalty associated with that. What I will say, though, and one of the caveats to this is that most commercial plans that are governed by ERISA typically do not fall under the prompt pay statutes of that state. They're obviously subject to federal law and the rules under ERISA. Unfortunately, ERISA has a prompt pay timeframe. It does not have a penalty associated with it. So what we've always told clients is within what we're evaluating, there's going to be both an opportunity to go back to payers that are subject to their state's Department of Insurance rules that would be eligible under interest and penalties to go after reimbursement for those providers. But then the information on a lot of the ERISA claims is supremely important for the managed care teams. And the reason for that is it gives them a sense and magnitude of the dollars that they're potentially missing due to late payments that are paid by the insurers themselves.
ERISA. What's ERISA?
Yeah, basically it's the, I don't remember the full details of the acronym itself, but it's basically...
I don't either.
Yeah, it's basically
we'll look it up.
The Social Security law, I think from 1972 or 1970, that basically gives certain plans, mostly obviously the self-insured plans, protections and guidelines under federal law. And obviously federal law supersedes state laws.
So the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. I put you on the spot. I didn't know it either.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's putting some guidelines and protections on the self-funded plans.
Yes, the self-insured plans where the insurer is just the third-party administrator for that plan.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a whole nother episode, Ray. I've heard you talk about that.
Yes.
Like on Ben Riegel's podcast, the OG, shout out to Ben Riegel.
Yeah.
When it comes to revenue cycle podcasts, there's a pretty considerable difference between the self-funded and the fully funded plans and how arguably revenue cycle teams should go about treating those and following up on those, which is something I've heard that you're discovering more and more. So you mentioned ERISA. Is there any other laws or contractual provisions here that we should be talking about that dictate these interest and penalties?
Well, at a high level, no. And I'll give you an analogy here. So if say your house was in a storm and you had all your shingles blown off your roof, right? And you called me and said, hey, I need you to go repair my roof. Well, when I create that contract with you to get that roof fixed, right? Typically in my contract, I'm going to say to you, if you don't pay your invoices on time, I'm going to charge you 1.5% interest per month until the full invoice is paid off. In most hospital settings that we have looked at and have partnered with, that language actually doesn't exist within their managed care contracts. And so typically what we see is in language at a very high level that says, interest, payments, etc., need to follow applicable state and or federal laws, right? And so what that does is it creates a scenario where those ERISA plans can actually come back and say, no, 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 like we're subject to federal laws, we're not subject to your state law. Our feedback to most organizations is you really need to look at getting that language included as part of your managed care contract and make it subject to all benefit plan types for that particular payer, whether they're ERISA, non-ERISA, et cetera. So that way you have a mechanism within your contracts really to hold the payer's feet to the fire in terms of getting those payments paid on time. I would also argue you really also need to evaluate as part of that structure which CARC and RARC codes you will allow the payer to utilize to delay that payment. So in a lot of cases, as you know, they'll send across the CARC code for missing documentation, when in reality, all the documentation is there. And so you really need to kind of get into the weeds of saying, hey, we're going to hold you subject to this rule that's going to not be any different than the state rule, right? You can kind of copy and paste in, but then there are stipulations that, you can't include a missing documentation denial as a means to delay the claim under this rule. And so there's a bunch of nuances and additional detail that we're trying to demonstrate to providers that, hey, if you start looking at this and negotiating this, you have a better leg to stand on if and when you go back to that payer in an effort to either improve payer behavior in terms of timeliness of payment, or to be able to capture that interest and or penalty payment if the payers don't subscribe or adhere to that mechanism within your contract.
Gotcha. Yeah, the definition of what qualifies as adjudication is what I would probably call it there. I'd be curious as you're giving that advice. Probably it sounds like maybe that's advice is still kind of in the early stages, or at least even if you're giving it, negotiations take forever, right? So I'd be curious to see what the feedback from the payers is on that, and if they're kind of willing to go to that length.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that and this will always be a struggle, but something that I think providers can take the lead on because it is pertinent to interest and penalties specifically, is really defining what a clean claim actually is. And the reason I say is what we see in often cases is a payer will submit an 837. The remit coming back will be a partial payment or a denial. Provider will submit additional documentation. Part of the remit that was denied gets overturned. They submit additional documentation, and the last part of the remit is finally overturned for full payment. But the key is the initial claim that was submitted, there was no void and rebill on that claim.
Uh-huh.
So if the payer is ultimately paying it at the end of the day, that inherently means that claim had to have been clean when initially submitted. And so when we walk people through that logic, they're like, yeah, that actually makes sense. If everything is based off a clean claim definition and you're not asking me to void and rebill or resubmit a new claim with late charges on it, right? Those scenarios make sense. But if it's the original claim that ultimately gets paid, then by the very definition, the payer is admitting that claim had to have been clean to begin with.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm going to do something that I never do
Okay.
and play the payer side. This show is brought to you by Real Partners Consulting, a free-to-provider vendor selection support company. We help healthcare providers find the right revenue cycle partners across technology, consulting, and managed services at no cost to you. If you like what you've heard from today's guest, or if you're looking for any other partner in the revenue cycle space, let us do the heavy lifting for you. Reach out to me, your host, Ryan Downs, on LinkedIn or at rdowns@realpartnersconsulting.com, and I will personally help you find the right fit. Now let's get back to the episode. I think my rebuttal to that might be, yes, you didn't change the claim itself, but I did not have enough information to actually determine that the claim was accurate. And that's why I needed to request that information.
Yep.
And that takes time, right? So that process. So I guess that could come back though to where, okay, hey, we've agreed that CART code 16 lacks info. I'm requesting more info. We've said that extends our timeline for interest and penalties. Then, okay, then we're fine, right? As long
Right.
as I use that every time I'm saying I need more information. So yeah, I think you could get there. Okay,
Yeah, I
that was
guess.
gross. I don't like playing the payer.
Yeah,
Um,
but the point is it's really setting up a combination of when will this be late and when will interest be owed? What terms and conditions is it subject to from a car code perspective? And we have to agree that what the definition of a clean claim is. And the reason I say that is if you look at most of the the prompt pay laws at a state level, all of them reference if a clean claim is submitted, it must be
uh,
either paid or
uh,
ignored. So that's why really getting into that definition of what that is and have an agreement between payer and provider in that case, as well as what work and car codes you can use, that's supremely important to really set up a good structure to be able to hold the payers accountable.
Gotcha. Okay, so they actually use the term clean claim in a lot of these state laws.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I've had another guest on before who, one of the things they market is clean improvement in clean claim rate. And I'm like, well, define that for me. What does clean claim actually mean? Because
Well,
I
yeah, I mean that is the problem in our industry is, 10 years ago, and this, everybody was like, "Hey, we got to get our clean claims rate up. We got to get our clean claims rate up." And everybody now is, it was in the mid 80s, 80 percentage 10 years ago. It's now probably close to 97, 95 plus percent, right? But over the same time period where those claim populations and the clean claim populations went up, denials also skyrocketed at the same time. So the two aren't directly proportionally related at
Mhm.
all, right? They should be inversely related and they're proportionally related. So it doesn't make sense to your point. Like clean claim is good, but it doesn't guarantee payment. And we've seen that because of the increase in denials over the same time period that these claims were supposed to be being much more cleanly sent out the door.
Yeah, and what you really want is that quick payment,
Yes.
and you need a clean claim for it, right? So it
Yeah. Oh,
leads
yeah.
you there. But yeah, the ultimate, I guess, rate, if you could, or metric, if you could, would be how often am I getting paid within a certain number of days. And again, clean claim rate is a prerequisite for that. But to your
Yes.
point, you could send a clean claim and still not get paid timely. And sometimes that is something that's within your control as the healthcare provider. Sometimes is payers being payers. Yeah, yeah, we know that all too well. All right, coming back, big picture, penalties and interest. Any common misconceptions or just mistakes that people have in this space?
It's not. It's not mistakes. The it's a challenge, and the reason is that the current EMRs that exist out there cannot calculate interest at a claim level, and so you really need to have a system, which is exactly what we built, that essentially builds out the entire life cycle of that claim and is able to account for any iterations of that claim over time or any iterations of the remit over time to be able to have kind of one view of when was that claim submitted, how was it responded to by the payer, when it was paid, when it was denied. So you're really kind of creating a time-based calculation over the life cycle of the claim. And the EMRs are not built to do that, right? They're built to say, I am owed this. I don't care when it's paid. I just know that I'm owed this based on what's in the contract. So that's the gap that we set out to solve, is, like I said, it's a challenge, right? And there was no existing technology. And so that's essentially what we have built is the ability to take in a provider's entire claims population, evaluate everything at a claim and remit level to understand the full life cycle of that claim. And then from that, we're able to grab timestamps that allow us to look in aggregate which claims should have paid interest and either didn't, or the payer paid interest below what they should have paid based on the information contained within the 837s and 835s.
Yeah, makes sense.
It
It,
sounds simple it's like, oh, interest. Like it's a simple thing. But when you actually look at the volume of when you're analyzing 7 to 8 million
oh
claims a
yeah.
year and then being able to isolate those that need to be evaluated based on the fact that they didn't pay interest on this particular piece, that's where the true challenge comes to bear.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like the concept of was this claim paid timely, not timely filing, but timely in terms of interest. The concept makes sense. But then, yes, it's okay. Was this specific claim, which which state is it qualifying under? Is there any contractual provisions that may differ from the state or federal law?
Yep.
Does it qualify under ERISA or not? I got a dynamic date, right? That's actually kind of helping us determine when the clock stops and starts and restarts, maybe?
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
defined? There is a restart?
That's the challenge of, once again, going back to the clean claim definition. So it's like trying to figure out a point in time when the clean claim, if it is initially denied, like when is that clean claim submitted? Is that the second claim? Is that the third? So you have to really understand. That's why I said, like, building out that life cycle is supremely important, because it may not be clean to start with, but at a certain point in time in that life cycle, it becomes clean. And that's the point in which you need to start measuring against when the payment is made.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's a new claim at that point. If you've changed something on it, right? It's got a new claim ID,
Yep.
um, despite it being for the same encounter. So yeah, you're restarting a clock then. So yeah, certainly a lot of rules and um, flows going into making sure you're tracking that. And it's crazy to me to think that we essentially, or at least most organizations, to my understanding, we just trust the payers on this one. We just trust that they're paying us interest correctly, timely, when they're supposed to. And I don't know any other strategy of trusting the payer that has
Yeah.
gone well for healthcare providers.
Well, and I'll give you a great example of this. We saw an instance where an 837 was submitted for an infusion, and then it had a variety of J codes associated with the drugs. And as in most cases this happens, the payer approved and paid for the infusion itself, but it denied all the drugs. And so it went through 3 different remits to get fully adjudicated for that single claim. And so what we saw is, on the first remit, there was interest that was paid because it was paid late. The second remit was paid late interest. The third remit, which was the last in the series, was paid with no interest. Keep in mind, you're looking at, 10, 20, 30 cents a claim. But when you aggregate that across millions of claims, all of a sudden it becomes a fairly meaningful value to the provider.
Yeah. So in that scenario, they admitted they owed interest with proof on 2 specific J codes, and then the same timeline for the third J code, and then they just didn't pay it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It's all
And
these
I mean,
nuances.
did they just miss it? Is something on their end, technically speaking? Did they do it intentionally? Who knows? Fact of the matter, payment was owed, not paid, and there's really not a good way for us to track it. And that's why I'm grateful that organizations like yours are building these things. So you mentioned it might just be a couple cents here and there, but there's a bigger picture to this. So how big is this opportunity?
Yeah. So most of our clients, we see roughly 1% to 2% of their claims population that is either miscalculated on interest, or interest is owed and wasn't paid. So not a huge population of encounters, but once you get to the 2%, and start aggregating it up, it also depends. So that's the volume perspective. The dollar associated with that will vary state to state. And that's solely because certain states have higher interest penalties. So certain states have upwards to 18% interest per annum.
Holy cow.
Yeah. 12%, 10 to 12% is typically where we see kind of the midpoint. And then there's some other states that have lower percentages than that. It also depends. Some states will say, hey, it's 45 business days to get something paid. Others will say 30 calendar days. A good example is the state of California in 25. The Medi-Cals and the HMOs were subject to a 45-day payment period, whereas all the commercial plans were subject to 30. Well, they changed the rules. So starting in 26, everybody is subject to the 30-day rule. And then we have other states like Texas, who probably has the most punitive rules in the country. Texas actually deploys a penalty payment. And so for Texas, the penalty has 3 tranches depending on how many days late it is. But the first tranche is lesser of $100K, or 50% of the difference between allowed and billed charges. So you can imagine that can get pretty big pretty quick.
50% of the difference between allowed and billed charges. Why?
That is the
Does
rule
that
that
matter?
they had set up. I'll give you my theory. They wanted to create a rule that was punitive enough that the payers actually took notice and said, we actually need to focus on getting these things paid timely, because if we don't, there is a massive penalty. And just so you know, once you go out to the second tranche in terms of days late, that goes to the lesser of 200K or 100% of the delta between bill charges and allowed amount. And then the third tranche is the same as the second tranche, but then they add in an 18% interest penalty on top of it. And so what ends up happening in that environment, 50% of it gets paid to the hospital. The other 50% gets paid to the Texas insurance risk pool. But as you can imagine, the delta between basically the contractual allowance for each of these encounters in some cases can be massive. So imagine as a payer, you're like, I'm not going to pay this claim on time. And then all of a sudden a provider comes back to you and says, oh, by the way, that's $100K that you now owe me. 50 goes to the TERP and 50% or 50K goes to me. It can add up very quickly. And there is not to get into too much of the weeds here, but there was and this is actually one of the reasons we went after building a technology in this area. If you look, there was a white paper that was created around the implementation of the Texas prompt pay policy. And what you saw over the course of a 10-year period was a drop of 80% on complaints associated with prompt pay issues.
It's working.
It's working.
What they found. Yeah.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Is that, you're right. I don't want to go too much deeper, but now you got my attention. The $100,000 penalty, or I guess it'd be lesser of, because it's usually going to be lesser of, but let's pretend it's $100,000 penalty. Is that like per instance of failure to pay timely?
Yes.
Every single account.
Yep.
Holy cow. Well, that's crazy. So I think, I was going to ask more about the challenges and why providers aren't doing this. I think we've hit it on the head already. That example right there is just for one state, tranches, even just figuring out what accounts qualify, resetting dates, and keeping up with the changes in percentages and lessers. I mean, that requires the technology in and of itself.
Yeah, it was fun when we started building it, because we literally sat down and we were writing down algebraic equations using compounding interest and those types of things. So we had to literally go do research, 8th grade algebra, and figure out the right equations that we were able to create, so that way we could apply those equations appropriately. Because Medicare has a compounding interest factor that most states don't. So we had to figure out, how do we create a compounding interest based on changing time frames, changing dollar amounts. So it was kind of fun. It was a lot of time, but we had to go through that process to make sure that we were getting it right.
Yeah, that's a lot of math. And when is it compounding, right? And tracking each one independently. Yeah. A lot of data, a lot of math. I'm picturing the web of process flows, probably pretty incredible.
We definitely nerded out over it for something, trying to figure it out.
As a self-proclaimed revenue cycle geek, I'm all in on nerding out.